So welcome everyone. This is the overview of the OpenAMP project. So the OpenAMP project has been going on for a few years, and we want to give you first just a quick recap on what it's all about, and but then going into a little bit more about the various working groups that we have, what's the update, what has happened since the last time, talk a little bit about how OpenAMP is being used in the industry, how to get involved, and also there's a couple of other related Linaro Connect talks here, so we'll just refer to those. All right, why don't we jump into it? Before that though, a bunch of acronyms. So if you guys want to take a screenshot of this, or you can go back after the fact and look up here, right? But there are lots of acronyms, and that's just the name of the game in our field, I guess. So we made it easy, make it easy for you and put it all in one slide here. All right, everyone figured out how to take that screenshot, so let's go to the next one. So what is the OpenAMP project? What are we trying to do here? Today's SOCs are very heterogeneous, and there's lots of complexity in it. There are lots of different execution units running there. So this happened to be one of our actually previous generation chips, where you have a bunch of Cortex-A's, you have a bunch of Cortex-R's, you have, in our case, since we're an FPGA company, we have what we call soft cores, called microblases. So you have all these different processors. And in the past, it's been fairly ad hoc. How do you interact between those things? How do you send messages? How do you start up something? How do you configure it? And so on and so forth. So the OpenAMP project was started to try to standardize and have open source projects for all that infrastructure around those different things. And we have 3 active working groups are looking at different parts of this puzzle here to solve it. And it gets fairly complicated because you also have different execution levels. So of course you can run things at a very low level, firmware level, hypervisor level, RTOS or Linux level, and so on. And all these guys need to be able to interact and so on. All right, let's go to the next slide here.
All right, so what is the project itself? So the community project was announced at Linaro Connect San Diego 2019. And I guess to make a distinction from its previous life when it was hosted at the Multi-Core Association, this is a community project now, and it's a bit bigger. So I guess this vision statement briefly summarizes what we're trying to achieve in terms of standardizing the interactions between the operating environments in a heterogeneous embedded system. The project itself, we've now got a board, a technical steering committee. We've got multiple working groups going, as Thomas mentioned, and we have a logo now. And then in terms of the update for the overall project, we now have 10 member companies. The company logos are listed below in alphabetical order. We have 3 active working groups. The release schedule had fallen off twice a year for some time, and so now it is back to a twice-a-year release schedule. We've got maintainers officially appointed, so that's Ed and Arno. And then we've also been formalizing the governance for the project. So we've defined the roles of the board, of the steering committee, of the working groups. There's officially now the issue tracking happening through GitHub issues. For contributions, those are now officially being done through GitHub pull requests. And then The coding style has also been chosen, so we're using the Zephyr coding style.
All right, so let's jump in a little bit to the three working groups. The first one has to do with remoteproc and rpmsg. So this is the life cycle. How do you start up something on another core and put something you can run there? How do you send messages back and forth and so on? Also have sort of lower level details there, things like virtio that's underneath the rpmsg. We have something we call libmetal, which is an abstraction of some of the hardware. So this group, also we call it OpenAMP Classic, because this is what OpenAMP started with. Now we have other things that we are working on as well. This group is led by Bill Mills, and there's a bunch of repositories, you can see that. One thing to be noted here is that since this code has to work in different environments, there are actually really two code bases here. There's one when you use the Linux kernel, obviously has to be GPL, and all that stuff is in Linux before, and that's one of the reasons we chose remoteproc and rpmsg, because it already existed there. So we're working on within the Linux community to update, streamline, make it easier and so on around remoteproc and rpmsg. But we also have a clean room implementation, and that's for RTOSes, but obviously for obvious reasons can't use GPL code from the Linux kernel. Also, it has to be really small, really scalable, so it can go down to something that's a very small footprint. And that actually was one of the earlier work that we did, was to get the code size down so that it can fit into resource constrained devices. So we have those two sides of it, and on our GitHub, there, of course, we have the library side, if you will, that RTOS even Linux user space can use that. There's an interface to that, so you can work in Linux user space and then talk to another RTOS here. Bunch of active work going on there, and you can see some of them here. There is a related session later today that will talk a little bit about some subsystem updates. All right, next one. System device tree working group. So within Linaro, there's a project called Linaro, well, it's device tree evolution. Device tree is this configuration format where you can configure so that the software knows about hardware specific things like addresses of device registers, various buses, topologies, power topologies, and so on and so forth, right? It's been in use for a long time from the Linux point of view and some other open source projects. What we're really driving now is to make sure that you can use device trees for a whole system, not just for one part of it, the address space that Linux sees, for example. But if you have multiple address spaces, we want to be able to talk about that and configure that. So that's what this working group is all about. And so one part of the Linaro project, it actually has multiple things they're working on around device trees, but the system device trees is actually led out of OpenAMP. And part of the reason there is so that we can have the RTOS guys, and they are changing or have been changing so that they use device trees to configure their RTOSes now. So the idea here is to get to a place where we have one true source for all the configuration work. So not going to go into all the details here because there's another session coming later here, and I will talk about device tree update and especially talk about some specific things that we're doing with device trees, bus firewalls, and an open source program called Lopper that will manipulate the device trees. And the next working group, we call that application services. By the way, the previous one is led by Stefano Stabellini from Xilinx. This one is led by Martin Koenig from Wind River. The idea of this group is So we have these lower level interfaces and lower level ways of communicating, and that's great. You have to have that. Most application developers, though, they are really more used to having industry standard interfaces like sockets, open and read and write, close, those kind of things. So what we're figuring out in this group is how can we add those things on top of it, so that when, for example, you want to have a connection to another, something that runs on an RTOS, on a MCU, for example, how could you use a socket interface, for example, or a virtio interface, things like that. And the more we work on this, the more it becomes clear that virtio is one of those really central technologies that we are going to work on. So this group, again, next level up from a, so that application developers have an easier time to use these heterogeneous systems. All right. So of course, there's one thing to have an open source project, and what we're trying to do in OpenAMP is both to drive the standards, if you will, but it's really standards by implementation. So it's the code itself that's really important. But you can have open source projects and no one is using it. So we actually went around a little bit and checked where in the industry are we using this right now. And it turns out that it's been used quite a bit. So for us, we from Xilinx, so we use it for all our devices. All our devices out there are heterogeneous in some sense. And so with the software package that you get from Xilinx, this is a default part of it, so that you can either at a very low level just share pages and so on, or at higher levels start up something on a different core and so on. Mentor Graphics, they have products based on OpenAMP, TI as well, and I'm not going to go into all the different details here. NXP is using remoteproc and for a bunch of different things. Calray is another company, so they put it into their products. Go to the next slide. So Sepehr is this open source real-time operating system. So OpenAMP is integrated and available in the current Sepehr releases. So that's their default communication between different cores in the same SoC. And Nordic Semi, they are using it. A lot of that is because they're using Sepehr, so in their products and their Bluetooth controller there. Linaro, of course, very involved, and Linaro Lite has people working on OpenAMP. SD Micro using, and they're very active. One of the maintainers is from SD Micro. Wind River, been using OpenAMP for a bunch of different things, and also for debugging. And ARM is very active in the discussions in OpenAMP as well. All right, go to the next one.
So now that we've gone through a bit about the project and the working groups and the latest updates, if there's anyone who is not involved yet and would be interested to get involved, everybody is welcome to join the calls for the steering committee and for the working groups. The call invitations are sent to the mailing lists. So you're all welcome to participate. It's not necessary to be member company employee. And for those companies that are very interested in being actively involved, they can join as OpenAMP community project members. We try to make the barrier to joining as low as possible. So it's not necessary to be a Linaro member company. There's a relatively low member fee, which supports the administration of the project and some infrastructure. And for the companies that join, they get a vote on the TSC and a vote on the board. But you can still participate even without having your company be a member. This is a little bit more information about how to become a member company. So it's relatively straightforward. And then this slide provides some more information if you would like to look up later how to check out the code. We have most of the repositories in the OpenAMP GitHub, but because Lopper is related to device trees, so that is living at the devicetree.org GitHub. The OpenAMP Wiki is where we have some working documents and also notes from the calls we try to post there. And there's some information about what is being worked on and what features are under consideration. We've got a community project website that you can check out. And most importantly, we have the mailing lists. So if you're interested in joining the calls, please do subscribe.
Just adding to the calls there. So for the various groups, the cadence is a little bit different. So for the remoteproc calls, that's every other Thursday, I believe. For the device tree calls, it comes and goes in bursts when we have new things to discuss. Right now, we're doing a lot of things around these firewalls, which has to do with protection that we'll talk about in a later discussion today. The application services, I would say right now we're sort of starting that up again after, so there's been a couple of calls here lately. So they vary a little bit. And then we have the technical steering committee, I would say about once a quarter or so, maybe every other 2 months sometimes, depending if we have a lot of things to do there. But we've gone through quite a bit of things there already when it comes to the governance, things that's more the stuff that you have to get done in the beginning. And then we have board meetings ever so often as well.
And then this is just some information about the related talks that are coming up. Thomas mentioned both of these earlier in the individual working group updates, but you can just make a note of those. And this is our last slide. So I'm going to put it back to the more information if anyone wants to refer to that, and then we can go to Q&A. So I guess, would we be having the questions come to us in the chat, or did somebody reading them out?
Yeah, so I don't see any coming through in the chat or in the YouTube. Also, people can raise their hand if they want to be unmuted and ask a question, so feel free to do that as well. But nothing yet, so I'll let you know if we see anything.
Yeah. I see on the list here that a lot of the people who are calling in probably has been in touch with us before as well. So that's good.
So I see we got one question from Karthik. What platforms do working groups use for testing?
That's a good question. That's actually one of the biggest things we've been working on lately is how do we do testing? Because every member company have different boards and things like that. And also what do we do in our CI loop? And so what we're using in our CI loops is QEMU. So that's the simulator, just to make sure that everyone has access to something that can run. Then, of course, the various individual companies, they are running tests on their boards. But we do have a common infrastructure. We're using Lava within Linaro and using QEMU for that. That's a very good question.
And then we've got a question from Satish. Is there any upcoming support for no copy rpmsg APIs? Like rpmsg Lite has APIs to alloc and free buffer.
Yeah, so one of the topics in the group is what we call big buffers. So that's basically a no copy. There are already implementations available where you allocate a buffer and then you just send a pointer over. So that's been open sourced as well. But to do that a little bit more in a structured way, that's one of the topics that's being discussed. But already today you can do that, and there is some code showing how to do it. And the idea is basically that you use rpmsg to send over a pointer basically to a common place where you have the actual data.
And then I guess Bill Mills has dropped a message in the chat, so everyone can check that out. Next question is, NXP's RPLC message Lite and ERPC also appear to be built over rpmsg. Could you compare the two?
Yes, and Bill, maybe we should unmute Bill here as well to chime in here a little bit. One of the things, so NXP obviously been doing a bunch of work with rpmsg and rpmsg Lite as well. And one of the differences I would say is that there's the community around the OpenAMP rpmsg. So we're actively working on it, and there's a bunch of work there to make it more decoupled and a bunch of different things with that. So that's really going on there. So maybe Bill, if you can add a little bit from your point of view.
Sorry, I got caught up in the mechanics here. Yeah, so rpmsg Lite is not, so it's the same API, but a different implementation. And then I think the ERPC was the other thing mentioned. Yeah, which is sort of a complementary technology that does build on top. The main lib OpenAMP is doing a lot of work to try to minimize the memory footprint differences between lib OpenAMP and rpmsg Lite. But they will probably both coexist as alternative implementations, at least for a while. Did that address the question properly?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Thank you.
And then we have a question about if Meta OpenAMP layer in Yocto project, if there is any plans to update that because it hasn't been updated in 2 years.
So maybe, I don't know, is that Ed is on the line here, right? And maybe we can get Ed Mooring unmuted. See, I don't see Ben on the line here, but.
Sorry, who did you want unmuted?
Yeah, Ed Mooring, yes, he's unmuted now.
You
So,
just,
yes.
yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Let's say it's on my radar, but it's a way, but it'll be a ways out. We use it internally for building the Linux side, but it doesn't currently build the firmware side. And that is, as I said, on my radar, but it's going to be a ways out. So yes, there are plans. They're just not immediate plans.
Maybe you can take another question. We have any pointers on the QEMU used and where people can look at that, because you've been involved in the CI loop, of course.
Currently, I'm using the Xilinx QEMU from Xilinx GitHub. I'm just putting the finishing touches on a Docker container for the latest released version of Xilinx QEMU, so you can just basically feed the container a URL for an image to load, and it will fire off QEMU for you and load and run that image.
Great. There's a question about address translation. Maybe Bill, you can take that, so I know the latest.
Okay.
It says, does OpenAMP support address translation? As an example, one core might not have the same view of memory as the M core, for example.
Yeah, so the RP message transport itself, that it's transparent to that. When you get into sharing buffers, as Thomas mentioned in the big data support, that can either be prearranged, in which case, and that's really the case that's covered today, and each side sort of knows how to get to the prearranged memory section. That's the most common one today. Doing that dynamically is sort of the, sort of the future of that big data sharing model, which is, one side could dynamically inform the other about a new shared memory area that it could use, and have maybe certainly the kernel drivers for RP message and remoteproc do set up an SMMU if that sits in front of the remoteproc. But what if the remoteproc itself has an MMU? How does that get set up? That's kind of, under discussion.
I think we're running out of time here, actually. There's a question about supporting Clang as a C frontend, I guess. I don't know, Ed, have you been using LLVM or Clang, or is it most, which compilers have been used so far?
Currently, it's GCC and IAR, but that's because that's a commercial compiler that's done in the individual, in individual companies, and the results ported back up. Clang is interesting, but again, it'll be a ways out unless somebody wants to dig in and send patches or send pull requests. Pull requests we will happily look at.
And I think we're out of time here. There's one, maybe Bill, very quickly. Can remoteproc be a submodule going future?
We actually have
we're out of time. Oh, we have time, okay.
Yep, so feel free.
All right, sorry. So Bill, maybe you can take that. Not sure exactly what submodule means there, but maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to handle that. I mean, are we talking kernel side? Certainly on the kernel, it can be loaded as it can be a loadable module. On the RTOS side, it's a library. It doesn't really make any statements about how you do image management for your firmware. So you could make it a separately loadable module if you had such a framework. It doesn't natively support that. Maybe the question is about, do we have a framework that allows you to dynamically load new modules on the RTOS side? That's not in scope today. That's an interesting concept.
Maybe you can also, and I don't know if on the library side, since it is library, if you only want to use remoteproc, do you drag in everything else, or how does that work? I don't know, but that could be part of the question.
Yeah, good point. Previously, they were sort of bundled together, and Ed probably better at current status, but there was a lot of work to break them apart. So the most common is you only want to use the RP message part. You don't want to use the remote proc part, and that's, you know, certainly doable.
All right, after a slow start, we got a lot of questions here. Have we missed any of the questions here? Just going through.
I don't see any that you missed.
Okay, good. All right, good. Really good questions. I hope this was useful to people. And if you have other questions, of course, you can always contact me or Natalie. And we have the contact information here on the side here. So thanks, everyone. And please join the other talks that we have a little bit later about system device trees and remote proc. Thanks.